So tonight, we are going to get into the history of the Long Island Power Authority, how it's structured, our case for why full municipalization or public power is the way to go for the future of the utility, and provide a chance for some Q&A exchange. So first, we're going to have a little bit of background and setting up the presentation. Then we'll again do a presentation on the history, the benefits of public power as we see, some alternative democratic governance models that we think would benefit the utility moving forward. And then we're going to have a moderated Q&A from participants. And I first, just given the fact that we have 129 people on this call with over 240 people registered, so hopefully more will be joining, I just want to name the various constituencies that are on this call. The first being our team, really a new group of people who came together in the aftermath of Tropical Storm Isaias, who deeply care about climate justice, economic democracy, and social justice, and saw the need to come together in response to the utility response. And so we're kind of a new ad hoc campaign of folks coming together around this to advocate for public power systems. So, you know, in the flurry of all the things, I realized I didn't introduce myself. So my name is Ryan Madden. I'm the sustainability organizer with the Long Island Progressive Coalition. And we have been working closely with both Suffolk and Nassau Democratic Socialists of America, Food and Water Watch, the Energy Democracy Alliance, and other supporters of the Reimagined LIPA statement that we'll share with you shortly. We are also joined by our presenters today, Dr. Michael Menser, who's an associate professor at Brooklyn College and the president of the board of directors for the Participatory Budgeting Project. He has also been deeply a close partner in our work over the last few months. We have Eleanor Stein, adjunct professor of climate change law and justice at the University of Albany and Albany Law School, and former administrative law judge and Rev project manager at the New York State Public Service Commission. We have Johanna Bazua, co-manager of the Climate and Energy Program at the Democracy Collaborative, and then Lisa Tyson, Long Island Progressive Coalition's director. I also want to acknowledge that we have LIPA board trustees on the call, along with LIPA staff members. We have people from different regulatory agencies and bodies like the Department of Public Service. And I don't know if they're on, but I believe some of them from the New York Power Authority also RSVP'd at one point. So I also want to acknowledge that we have a diversity of elected officials on from the New York State Senate, the New York State Assembly, county legislators, and town officials, and also other stakeholders who are invested in the future of this utility, including solar industry groups, business groups, and labor groups. So we are quite glad to have such a diverse constituency of stakeholders here, including our grassroots supporters, public power advocates, and energy democracy champions, both here on Long Island, regionally, and across New York State, because a lot of eyes are on Long Island in the fight for public power. And so I just want to name, before handing it off to Lisa, kind of what this forum is and what it isn't. We see this right now as a space for us to make the case for public power, for a reimagined Long Island Power Authority. And so this is a space where we'll offer a chance for clarifying questions about public power. What we'll be offering is a kind of pluralistic approach to the future of the utility that prioritizes democratic participation, equity, and accountability, no matter what path is pursued. We will not be able to address everything. These are deeply complicated issues, but what we're offering is a new set of structures to help us address a lot of the issues around the governance and management of the utility. And as you'll see, the chat is closed and will be until we get to the Q&A section to really have people focus on the presentation. And I'll just note that the Q&A itself will provide an opportunity for people to weigh in with comments and questions in the chat. But given the diverse constituency of people on the call, we won't be opening it up for people to provide spoken comment. We think that would get unruly pretty quickly, given the diversity of voices, and we want to ensure that no one entity monopolizes the conversation. So if you submit thoughts, comments, or questions in the chat, I will do my best to read them out loud and put them towards the panel. We'll also be saving the chat, and we'll be able to follow up with particular questions as folks see fit. And with that, I'm going to pass to our director, Lisa Tyson.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ryan, and really appreciate all the work that you've done and the committee has done to put into this event. It's an amazing turnout, and once we started advertising this event, more and more people came, and now we're hearing about Texas, and we know now, even more than ever, how important this mission we are on is. My mind keeps bringing back to Long Island. Are we ready for more storms? Do we have the systems in place to keep the power on and the people safe? And the answer is no. The story of Texas is not about oil and gas supplies alone, or even breaking pipes. It's about the corporate greed that has led the state into this disaster. We have seen that corporate greed here on Long Island with our utilities as well. In October 2019, Governor Cuomo orders National Grid to restore gas to 1,157 homes and businesses. They literally denied gas hookups so they could get the approval to build a pipeline to increase their shareholders' profits. PSE&G has failed. They failed during the storm. They continue to lie and to continue to downplay the danger that they have put all Long Islanders in. And we are in a pandemic with major health issues right now, which you're going to hear later in detail about the reality of what has happened in the past. And energy is an essential service. It should not be impacted by the whims of wealthy white men who want to fill their bank accounts. This is the history of Long Island utilities everywhere, really. And whether it's electricity, garbage, or water, privatization is a disaster, both financially and for quality service. In our fragmented government structure, where we have 10 towns, 2 cities, literally hundreds of small governments and villages, exasperates the situation and prevents elected officials from having any control over this situation of energy of any of our services. As news of PSE&G response and as news of the PSE&G response and their responsibilities have been reported, we brought together organizations and individuals and experts who believe in a brighter future for utilities on Long Island. We have researched, met with experts and elected officials. We quickly mobilized together and we created the Reimagined LIPA municipal statement. It's going to be shared with you in the chat. Already 30 organizations have signed on. In just a few weeks, we've been starting this work and getting the statement out, including community organizations, environmental, health, indigenous, and business groups. The signatories represent some of the most impacted communities and have never had a seat at the table to determine their own energy future. They want and are ready for that seat at the table. The following presentation is both educational around what went wrong at PSE&G, educates on successful municipal systems around the country, and how we believe we should be going forward in becoming a fully municipal system and how that system should be run on Long Island. We feel strongly the management and the structure needs to be changed, and we look forward to working with community stakeholders to determine and work towards those changes in the future. We truly believe that a LIPA that prioritizes equity, community, workers, and meaningful democratic participation can raise all boats and prepare us for our future on this land. And so I am going to pass you to the next speaker, the adjunct professor, climate change, law and justice, University at Albany Law School, former administrative law judge, and Rev project manager in New York State. I'm sorry, I have a little child here. So I will pass it on to Eleanor Stein.
Hi. I'm glad your assistant has shown up just in time. So I'm very glad to be here with you and send my greetings. I think I probably know several of you from my years at the Public Service Commission or, in the movement for a fairer, juster, cleaner energy system. I want to make it clear that I do not speak for the Public Service Commission tonight in any way. And in the 5 years since I've left, I have really focused my work on renewable energy, climate change, climate justice, environmental justice, and the intersection of all of those fields. And I've been working with regulators, with communities, with government, utilities, both nationally and internationally, with Rocky Mountain Institute and other organizations over these years. So I'm hoping to add a broader context to this conversation, because I think that the crises that you're facing and the decisions that you're facing are ones that are being faced by people all over the country and all over the world, actually. And so just the scope of what you're undertaking, what you're facing is shared and is momentous. I think the decisions that LIPA will be making, that the people of Long Island will be facing and making, are momentous to contemplate. And so I suggest it's both appropriate and might be helpful to you to see how those decisions are playing out in other places in the context of the growing climate crisis, and how to meet it, as well as how to safeguard all of our communities from what we know will be fiercer and fiercer extreme climate impacts. So that's my start. The next thing I want to mention is that you are definitely not alone. The issue of the limitations of private power that have been exposed by climate change and inequities in the system, and the potential of public power are issues that are under discussion all across our country. I've participated in them in California, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Australia, in France. And these are momentous decisions that you're facing. So I think energy systems all over our country and around the world are facing the same challenges, not only because our electric system has proven inadequate in many ways to meet severe climate change. And our scientists tell us that these impacts are going to become qualitatively more fierce. So we can't look back to, let's respond to Isaias. I remember when we were trying to look back and respond to Superstorm Sandy and realizing that was actually not our job, and it's not Long Island's job. We're in a situation where the past is no longer a guide to the future. And that's a really profound change for the energy industry and many others. So what are the tools that we need to face that situation? One is that I would really commend you, and it's possible that I know many of you have done this, and maybe LIPA has done it, but to enlist some of the first-rank climate scientists that you have available in your communities, the Brookhaven National Laboratories and other places, to help you develop long-range forecasts of specific climate change impacts on Long Island. Con Edison did this with the Earth Institute after Superstorm Sandy. It was ordered to do it by the Public Service Commission, which also urged all the other utilities to do this. And now, really for the first time, the science and the modeling has been developed to the point where analyses can be that granular and that local. This was not true even 5 years ago. So there are tools to know what's coming. And of course, it's not only going to be Isaiah's kind of storms. You're at great risk for sea level rise, extreme heat events, extreme rainfall events. I know that you know this. But to plan, you need that roadmap, and it can be done with the help of climate scientists. And I think Con Ed's just came out recently, so I commend it to you. So I think that you have realized clearly that the damage done by Isaias raises those really fundamental challenges to the system as it currently exists. So for example, what electric system operators in California found, and also in Australia and in the UK, when they're analyzing the failures and the blackouts and the breakdowns of the electric system under climate stress, was that they were beginning to operate a very different power system than the one we've had in the past. And that to operate it successfully under stress meant to have minute to minute what people call situational awareness of what is going on, what are the stressors hitting your system, who is out, who's frozen, what's the weather going to be like in an hour and 15 minutes. And that's a level of awareness which our electric systems need. And I think we've always need, I think LIPA has met, has failed that test in the last events of the last year, but I think all of the utilities are really stressed to have that kind of situational awareness on a real-time basis. Maybe you can call it artificial intelligence, you can call it data. I like to call it situational awareness. And I think that when you're looking forward at what kind of system you want to have, you should really look hard at the incumbency. Are they providing not just what we need to keep customers informed and safe, which is critical, but also to really understand what's happening in your system. So the other thing is just to make the point that globally, the project of decarbonization, as we call it deep decarbonization, is for our country is really to be defined as first the decarbonization of the electric generation sector. And that's something that we know how to do. We have the technology. On Long Island, you're super fortunate to be getting 2 enormous offshore wind plants, which will add to your renewable resources. And once we decarbonize the electric sector, then we have to electrify all the other sectors of our economy. That's the basis of our plan. Transportation, buildings, industry, everything. And those are major changes which are still ahead of us and present huge challenges. So in a way, if you're a power company, public or private, you're looking at a huge expansion of your responsibilities and your opportunities. And there's a lot of focus on your ability to get this done fast and safely, and with the participation of your customers and your communities. So the only other thing I'll say is I just want to point to one little obscure section of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And I don't know if Senator Kaminsky is here or members of his staff, but I do want to give you a shout out for being the lead sponsor on that legislation, which also has been being studied around the country and around the world and has really changed. This changes everything. So there's a requirement in the law that applies to state agencies and authorities that says considering decisions, including the execution of contracts, all state authorities shall consider whether such decisions are inconsistent with or will interfere with the attainment of the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits. So I would just commend to the LIPA board in its consideration that requirement, I think, will apply to them in making their decisions at the end of March about what the future of the company, and would really places some parameters around that decision-making process. So with that context and thoughts, I'd like to hand back over to Michael for the rest of the presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Stein. Welcome, everybody. I'm Mike Metzer from Professor at Brooklyn College, and we're going to get into the presentation now. I'm going to be presenting with Joanna Bozua. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And again, welcome to our event. Joanna and I are going to talk for about the next 35 minutes or so. We're going to go into a variety of details. Just want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in this and where Joanna's coming from. Joanna, as Ryan and had said at the beginning, is from the Democracy Collaborative, which is a research nonprofit that's been working in this space for several years. Joanna has written a series of papers, reports, news articles, really detailing the opportunities that public power and other fights over other public goods can make, the kind of difference they can make in this moment. And I'm coming at this, I've been a professor at Brooklyn College for 25 years, and I've been writing and teaching about this for many, many years, both from two sides. One is the climate change adaptation side, as well as the participatory democracy or participatory governance side. How do we get government to work better in this space? But I haven't just done that from the kind of ivory tower, although CUNY is certainly not an ivory tower. It's maybe a broken tower. But I've also worked as a co-founder of a nonprofit called the Participatory Budgeting Project, which has helped cities across the United States to actually work better with communities around budgets, and have been doing that work again, in New York, in California, in the South, in the Midwest, in Chicago, upstate, and really really have learned quite a bit from watching governments try to work better with communities to have public input on service delivery around key things that people need to be able to live their lives. And the other hat that I wear is, as Eleanor was saying, I've had the good opportunity. There's tremendous climate science community in this region, as you would expect. And I'm the Associate Director for Public Engagement at the Science and Resilience Institute, which works with climate scientists, particularly around Jamaica Bay, but connecting to water issues and energy issues in that area. And a lot of things that we're going to be talking about with respect to energy tonight, you might also think are relevant for water. And Long Island, like a lot of places, is also having a lot of conversations about what the future of water is. So that's just some of the background there. Our argument for municipalization is the situation is worsening and change is urgent. We've had worsening storms and heat and cold waves. The Texas is just the horrifying latest example in a series of catastrophes that have caused catastrophic system collapse in a lot of different places across this country. 4.3 million Texans lost power. 7 million have had to boil water after this last winter storm. And Isaias, of course, a lot of us, including me, as a longtime Long Island resident, had 420,000 Long Island residents lose power for multiple days. Earlier in the year, we had California, which had to have rolling blackouts due to an unusual heat wave. 2 years before that, the utility in California and Northern California, PG&E, which Joanna has written about, was so negligent in its operations that a fire was caused by a downed power line, which killed 84 people in one of the worst fire calamities in US history. Before that, Hurricane Maria wiped out the entire electricity grid of Puerto Rico and one of the strongest storms ever recorded on planet Earth. And going back a few years before that, Superstorm Sandy changed the way we understand these issues in the New York City metropolitan region. So change is urgent. We're going to argue tonight that PSEG, we'll call it PSEG, PSE&G, cannot be trusted. It's time to terminate their contract. The public-private model, that is this model where there's a public authority that contracts out to a private utility, is fatally flawed and inadequate. It must be eliminated, and LIPA must take on the fully public management. LIPA states they have the capacity to exclusively carry this out in its day-to-day operations. Public power works in the United States, in New York State and Long Island, and Joanna is going to give us more details on that part. It's more affordable and reliable, and the funds can be reinvested to enhance resilience and address local need.
Michael, before you go on, do you mind sharing full screen?
Absolutely.
I think just hit present and you'll be good. Thank you.
All right. That's good? Thank you.
That's good.
So the vision is a new, more accountable, democratic, sustainable, resilient, and innovative LIPA. That's a long list of, and it's ambitious, but we're long on. Come on. The goal is not to give more power and responsibility to LIPA as it is now, but to restructure LIPA to fulfill its mission, meet New York State goals of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and become more resilient. Municipalization is not a government takeover. There's confusion around what that word means. We're going to talk about that. A public authority is a separate entity with a distinct governing board, budget, and mission. Nor would LIPA have to purchase power plants or seize property. It would take on maintenance of a grid it already owns. And really, you know, and this part always is amazing, this is a cheaper way to go. This is a cheaper way to go. Now, when I can't, okay, here we go, sorry. So we're going to go through the current situation. We're going to do a brief history. We'll talk about what a fully public LIPA could look like. We'll talk about how to create and strengthen partnerships with diverse stakeholders in terms of affordability, reliability, sustainability, climate justice, and resilience. And then we'll talk about how you can get involved. So the Long Island Power Authority mission and governance structure as is now. There's a board of trustees whose mission is to enable clean, reliable, and affordable electric service for customers on Long Island and the Rockaways. The board supervises, regulates, and makes policy for the authority and appoints the chief executive officer. It's composed of 9 trustees. It gets a little bit more political here. We've got 5 appointed by the governor, 2 by the president of the state senate, 2 by the speaker of the assembly, and they serve staggered 4-year terms. There's 3 committees where a board does a lot of its work, right? Finance and audit, oversight and clean energy, governance, planning, and personnel. And we have ideas about modifying all this, which we'll get into. The current situation with LIPA and PSEG. There's about a little over 1 million customers across Nassau, Suffolk, and the Rockaways. LIPA itself has about 50 employees, primarily managerial. LIPA contracts to PSEG to provide transmission and distribution system operations, power supply planning, information technology, call centers, infamously, engineering, energy efficiency programs. PSEG Long Island also subcontracts some services itself, such as advertising, marketing. And PSEG Long Island employs 18 managers at a cost of $80 million a year. If you're doing math right now, you might be double checking it. That's correct. They lead the 2,500 employee ServCo workforce that provides utility core services like the line workers and so on. So how did we get here? In the 1980s, Lilco was the private utility for Long Island. And there was a big public battle in the 1980s over the planning around the Shoreham nuclear facility. A lot of folks were against it and stopped it from ever operating. But the amount of money that went into the construction of it created an enormous debt for Long Islanders, which we're still paying off to this day, which has a big impact on our electricity rates. LIPA then was created in 1986, but rather going for that fully public model that a lot of other places in the United States have done, it was ordered to contract out a lot of its services on the management of the grid, to, in that time, it was National Grid, which was a UK energy firm. That relationship continued into 2012 when Superstorm Sandy created a devastating impact up and down the East Coast and the Caribbean and East Coast. And many of us, I lost power for 2 weeks. I'm sure other people had similar experiences. And the response was so poor that the state stepped in, terminated the contract, brought in the firm from New Jersey, PSEG, which created a Long Island office. And that's been the situation since 2013 or so. And then here we are with Isaias over the summer and the horrible response there, leading to the current debate that we're having. So problems with LIPA's public-private model. So this isn't just about PSEG, right? We had the same problems with National Grid, and but before that, we had the private utility, and that didn't serve us well either. The rates. This is a lot of, this is the most tangible part for a lot of folks. Yeah, we're expensive. We're not as expensive as Con Ed. Maybe you take a little bit of that. Apologies to the New York City folks on the call. But you go from Pennsylvania to Baltimore to upstate to Pennsylvania to New Jersey to Pennsylvania to Maryland, and they all pay less. So this power that we pay more for is not renewable. It's mostly not renewable. In New York State, renewable power comprises only 28% of the electricity mix, but most of that is that Niagara hydro. Only 5% is wind and solar. About the same situation for LIPA PSEG. And yet under the landmark Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, passed in 2019, which groups all over the state work so hard to put forward, we have a state mandate to reach 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% by 2040. And we're at 5% or 28% if you're more generous, depending on how you slice it. So we're not moving fast enough. The public-private model is unreliable. We saw this with Sandy. We see this with Isaias. It's easy to get the Newsday headlines confused. Which storm was that? LIPA itself, I think we're getting bombed. Or somebody see that? Somebody's writing on my screen.
That is interesting.
Okay. Sure. It could have been something wacky on my end. That's not impossible given my situation. Let me try this again. Share screen. All right. So this model is unaccountable. We haven't been able to get the private utilities. Here we go again. Ryan, do you want to try sharing screen?
Sure.
I've seen worse, let's put it that way. There it is. Let's see, somebody's raising their hand. I think, so let me try sharing a different, maybe I'll try and share the PowerPoint instead of the Google Slides.
Okay. That is quite weird. Apologies for the technical snafu, everyone. I think I'm being messaged by someone separately that whoever the admin is can disable the whiteboard settings. It happened to a partner of theirs Zoom account before. So you might just want to change the settings. So if you're able to do that.
All right, so I'll share it again. And we're on unaccountable.
And you could do full screen again. And hopefully we'll be good. Thanks for sticking with us, folks.
All right. Well.
All right. Well, let me try then.
So public-private is unaccountable. We've seen the lack of response after the storms. Next. And according to LIPA's own SIE's task force report, PSEG lied about its preparedness for the storm, its immediate response to the storm, and the number of upgrades it made afterwards. Management failures are the root cause, not the workers, not the line workers. Very important to say that many times. This was a management failure and failure of leadership. Next. Next, same point from LIPA's report, the key findings. Next. All this was avoidable. So where do we go from here? Next. So we could terminate, we need to terminate the PSEG contract. You could hire another private utility, Con Ed. How would people feel about that? That excites people. That doesn't seem to be too much on the table at this point. You could renegotiate terms with PSEG and maybe subcontract services like IT where it failed. That is something that's being explored by the LIPA board. Or you could go fully public. Next. So full municipalization plus democratic restructuring is the best path forward for Long Island. Next. In its own words, LIPA says this would save money and it's ready to do it. Next. Here's details now, and we will share this presentation in its preserved state if people want to go back through this more slowly to look at some of this. But this is basically what municipalization would look like. There will be a hiring of a dozen LIPA management employees. This would eliminate an $80 million management fee that currently LIPA pays to PSEG. It would eliminate a $20 million per year in PSEG affiliate charges for shared services. There would be some transferring of salaries and benefits of Serco employees. This required the state, New York State would have to act for LIPA to become fully public. And there would be one-time transition costs, but each year it would be cost savings and adds up tremendously over the next decade. Next. So what would it mean and how it could happen? Again, the LIPA board would have to say we're municipalizing. Then the New York State legislature would have to pass legislation to put through the new model. According to the current rules, as best we understand, it would be a 6-month transition process to a newly restructured LIPA. And that would mean LIPA takes full control of the electric power system in its management and its operations. And as a nonprofit, right, you go from a for-profit, like Lisa was talking about, to a nonprofit, and distribute benefits in accordance with its customers and the local public good. Next. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna Bozua to talk about public power and its benefits. Joanna. Back up and unmute Joanna.
There we go. Unmuted. Amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks all for having me today. Yeah, so as Mike mentioned, I do a lot of research on utilities, utility justice, and particularly ownership structures. And so, you know, I wanted to kind of check in about kind of what the landscape looks like when it comes to public power and some of the benefits that are associated. So from the beginning, I thought, you know, worthwhile zapping some of the myths that we often see related to public power. You know, we see often that, you know, well, you know, I think private utilities are going to be more efficient, or they're going to stifle the innovation instead of create a system of innovation in this like important moment. But you know, actually, from my perspective and from what we've seen in terms of some of the data, public power really has a lot of benefits that confront those different types of myths. First of all, public power is quite pervasive in the United States. Between rural electric cooperatives and publicly owned utilities, it provides energy services for about 1 in 3 people in the United States. So this is not something that is untested by any means. And on average, what we see is that public power provides cheaper energy, about 13% cheaper across the United States as compared to its private counterparts. And as multiple people have already mentioned on this call, Texas is a clear example of major issues of reliability and the realities that we are confronting with climate change, and how incredibly important it is for us to have a reliable and resilient grid. And what we have seen is that over the years, public power has actually been has had shorter outage times overall and more reliable, which is key and core to the type of energy system we need to be building in the future. It also is quite innovative. You know, we'll get into this a little bit more in some of the examples and in the next couple of slides, but we are seeing public power often on the cutting edge of some of the innovations we need in the energy system. For instance, and what we're seeing in a lot of, for instance, rural areas that didn't have access to broadband, it was very shoddy. These publicly owned utilities are actually saying like, hey, we actually own these wires already, we own these poles, and that means that we can provide affordable and accessible broadband in ways that the private industry is not providing yet. And while I say in rural areas, this is also true in more urban areas as well, that publicly owned utilities are on some of the more cutting edge systems of broadband, as well as renewable energy. So if we could go to the next slide. You know, when it comes to the types, just to give you some flavor for the types of utilities that are out there, I like often to point to Nebraska, not only because my partner is from Nebraska and I got to go see it in real life, public power in action, but also because it's the only state that is truly fully run by public power. They expelled their private utilities in the 1920s and 30s because of the exorbitant rates that were being, you know, extracted from them. And so at that point, they moved to a fully public power and cooperative rural electric co-op system that still operates today. And they have quite a range of different governance systems within that. And they've created systems of interdependency that I think stands out as models for how different utilities can support one another. There are also in Omaha, which is one of the biggest ones, they have elected boards in which we've also seen climate advocates be able to run for those boards and win, changing the and shifting the tides of direction in Omaha, which is really powerful. In Sacramento, we have this happened in the 1940s, 1950s, that Sacramento determined that PG&E was not achieving what it needed in order to provide a basic public service. And so they took over the utility, transferred the workers, and now have again, one of the more innovative utilities that is out there. They were on the cutting edge of efficiency in a way that many other utilities were not in the 1970s, and instituted some of the first auditing systems so that people could free audits for energy efficiency. We mentioned broadband. Chattanooga, Tennessee, a perfect example of where we're seeing innovation. And also access being really key and core as an entity that is trying to provide public services. Chattanooga decided to invest specifically in, it already had a publicly owned system, and so they invested in broadband, which has been a major source of economic development for Chattanooga, and also make sure that they have accessible and cheaper rates when it comes to both broadband and power. And then a very recent one, relatively recent in terms of municipalization, was in Winter Park, Florida. They, similarly to Long Island, had been dealing with substantial problems related to reliability, particularly with the increasing number of storms. And this is in 2003, where they needed to be able to take over their energy system from the Florida utilities, who are notoriously bad at investing in their system and particularly transitioning to renewable energy. So now Winter Park, Florida, they took on the big utility and won, and actually have been able to increase reliability, underground a lot of their lines, and invest in renewable energy. And so I think that this really shows that when you invest in a publicly owned system, there's so much more that's at your disposal in terms of setting up governance and accountability structures, in terms of investing in what your community needs, like broadband, like building up resiliency. And it, as an entity, public ownership allows for some more malleability, and we get to set the scene for a 21st century energy grid in a way that I think a lot of the private utilities are not up to snuff, and are more interested in providing those types of shareholder profits in the private energy industry than they are in actually reinvesting in the grid, making sure that we're creating a safe, clean grid that actually can support people in going to work in that area. So yeah, if we can go to the next slide. And just to kind of put a finer point on what I see as four really key components of what public power can bring, is that, the reinvestment component, that public power can really give back. In its 2016 study done by the American Public Power Association, it found that publicly owned utilities were giving more back to their communities monetarily than investor-owned utilities. They also, a fun fact here, all of the utilities that are currently running off of 100% renewable energy are publicly owned. And it's 6 right now, but I think that and if you consider a lot of the California communities that are starting to shift towards what is called community choice aggregation, where we can count even more. So really, when you have public ownership, it allows you to take control over your energy future in a way that you don't, I would say that you don't with private utilities. The benefits are also staying local. Your shareholders aren't being extracted and sitting in a headquarters halfway around the world. They are going back into their grid. They're going into more affordable rates. And it also gives the community a voice. And Mike already put this forward a little bit in what he was saying, and I'm sure it will be brought up more time and time again, that having the opportunity to build democratic governance into our utilities when it is such a public and vital service is key to actually ensuring that we're serving communities and providing a framework for climate justice and the transformation that we absolutely need moving forward. So I think I can jump it back over to Mike now, right?
Thank you, Joanna. Really, really hitting all the different dimensions that are at play here. And again, it's energy, but it's a lot of other things. And we sometimes forget about the interconnection between energy and these other goods, like energy and water, as we're seeing in the South right now. But also there are these new potentials like energy and broadband. And on the resilient note, in New York, the village that got back quickest after Isaias was the one that had public power. That's Freeport. And they've been that way since 1898. And so here is an example of how it's done in Long Island. And because they didn't have to ship those profits to shareholders in distant lands, they could funnel it into things like tree trimming and infrastructure investments. And even radical newspapers like the Wall Street Journal took note of that. Next. So what could a restructured fully public LIPA accomplish? Instead of bonuses, again, to unaccountable management or dividends to these distant stockholders, LIPA could lower rates, especially for low income seniors and small businesses. It could reinvest profits to enhance resilience, like bury lines to reduce future outages. That was the first thing Winter Park did in Florida, is you put them underground, you get a lot more, they're a lot more reliable. You could improve service to customers with special needs, such as individuals requiring medical equipment. We heard a lot about this in Isaias. People who rely on refrigerators, rely on respirators, other kinds of electrified equipment, who were really precariously positioned with that power outage. And not to mention the Cold Spring Laboratory, which does COVID research, which lost power for 5 days during a pandemic. Not an ideal situation. A fully public LIPA could also support community solar, which was the case, but in 2009, LIPA made some changes there, which impedes that, and also support more wide-ranging conservation programs, some of which LIPA customers are now eligible for, like Heat Smart. And a fully public LIPA could seek out public-public partnerships that improve service delivery and community resilience, such as partnering with public bus systems to reduce emissions, improve air quality and reliability through electrification, like the New York Power Authority is doing upstate in a variety of towns and at JFK Airport. Why not Long Island? Next. Other projects, energy investment districts to build locally accountable green electric infrastructure in low-income communities to spur economic development and improve residents' health. This is happening in Iowa. This is happening in Tennessee, as Joanna noted, and in New Mexico. Develop the highest safety standards for workers and communities. Work with local governments to create organized emergency response plan for when the power does go out. That was half the disaster in Isaias. We had folks, some with portable generators, some are breathing in the fumes, they're not operating correctly. There's a lot of safety issues with those. Where's the organized response so that people do know what to do? Because things do, given the intensity of the challenges we have to prepare for that as well. And create a new public process to fairly deal with the issue of pilots, the payments in lieu of taxes. If LIPA's public, it doesn't pay property taxes the way a private business would. So it's got to pay, make payments that are fair with respect to the locales. And this has been an issue on Long Island. So we need a better process for that, for siting energy projects, and even the placing of poles and lines. In Garden City, they just had a big fight over this, and PSEG's gonna have to pull up a bunch of poles. Next. LIPA, though, even if it went fully public, needs more effective oversight. Right now, it's the Department of Public Service Long Island office. It was set up after Sandy, the failure there, but it has limited powers, yet a very high budget, $5.5 million annual budget as of 2017, paid for by LIPA ratepayers. But it hasn't been able to catch the problems before they happen, nor make PSEG do the upgrades that it's promised to do. Next. So a new model for accountability, the Long Island Energy Observatory. In our research, we were looking at other things that other states do in the US and other countries do across the world. And one thing that was really inspiring is this idea of an observatory, which is an independent non-governmental organization that would conduct research, convene stakeholders, and promote sustained public engagement and participatory democracy in the pursuit of affordable, reliable, resilient power system. It could be hosted by academic institutions right here in Long Island and partner with already existing New York Energy Policy Institute, which is at SUNY Stony Brook, which works on a lot of the technical research. The primary functions of the observatory would, again, to do that research on how much does the undergrounding cost? What is the most effective way to do it? Convening the public, what are the needs that people have and the ideas that people have? Make proposals and monitor the utility. And how could it be funded? Well, you could redirect some of that ratepayer funds that goes to DPS Long Island and put them in the observatory. Next. It could conduct participatory action research to better address the needs of communities, individuals, and businesses and inform the planning process rather than the after the disaster hearings. The after the disaster hearings don't cut it. That does not cut it as public engagement. This is one of the things I've been working on for the last 12 years. There are much better ways of doing that in the planning process. There's all kinds of technologies that can be utilized nowadays, Polis, Mentimeter, many, many others, to get that real-time interaction from folks situated in different spaces and basements. And this will be ways of gathering ideas for programs and also commenting on things like the LIPA budget, which right now is something that's very difficult to participate in. Next. The observatory can make LIPA more democratic by promoting accountability, participation, and innovation to achieve these goals that we've talked about and in the state legislation. There could be public deliberative forums for residents to discuss rate changes, propose referendums on research projects. Maybe your community is very interested in solar for your community. What would that look like? Or weigh in on key issues, as is already done by the Sacramento Municipal Utility that Joanna mentioned. There could be collaboration with local governments on emergency response planning. This was brought up at a DPS hearing by one of the town supervisors. There's participatory budgeting, which I've worked on for many years, where residents can make proposals and implement projects. This is done in 25 cities. And in Portugal, of which, we got the Long Island link to Portugal, they've done it for energy conservation projects, which have been very powerful and effective for their energy use. There could be special councils on worker safety, labor issues, and to promote sustainability, inclusion, and diversity in the supply chain. I happen to notice that LIPA has not done well in the MWBEs, the Minority and Women Business Enterprise mandate for its supply chain and purchasing. And it would have the power to put issues before the board to receive a timely response about these ideas. Next. So another way to make LIPA more accountable, modify the mission. Don't just have clean, affordable, reliable, put in sustained and resilient. Make the board commit to these values as well. Add a non-voting member to the board to assist with public engagement. That's another route you could do it in conjunction with the observatory or not. Add a special committee on climate justice and meeting the CLCPA goals. We want Long Island to be a leader, right? We want Long Island to be a leader, an innovative leader. Eliminate the current advisory board, which doesn't seem to have much of a function, and create a formal relationship with the observatory or other university partners. Next. Another possibility, legislative path for structural reform. Some folks I know have seen this is from Senator Garin, which was proposed in 2019, replaces the current LIPA board structure. The chairman still appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, but the 8 other trustees would be elected from 8 districts of equal population across the island. This would be established by the legislature. Rate plan approvals would be preceded by public hearings in each county, and the Department of Public Service would be prohibited from recommending a rate increase unless to offset revenue loss due to energy conservation efforts by consumers. So this is another route. Next. Another legislative possibility, which is in the works this year, is the New York Utility Democracy Act. This would begin the transition to full public ownership and elected utility boards within 2 years across the state, redrawing energy territories along principles of environmental justice, equity, and energy democracy. It would eliminate the incentive to build unnecessary infrastructure. The national grid, some of the national grid was mentioned earlier. Incentivize maintenance and resiliency projects like undergrounding, as we talked about, and microgrids by mandating public cost-benefit analysis of all spending proposals. This would be a statewide utility board, again, with representation from different constituencies. Next. Here we are at the end. We're about to have the conversation. So the conclusions. LIPA's public-private approach towards governance and management is not up to the considerable challenges and the opportunities of the moment. Terminate the PSEG contract, begin restructuring in a manner that makes it accountable to ratepayers and capable of meeting the energy goals for New York State. Involve experts and local stakeholders and residents in the transition right now, right? This is not the only conversation we need to have. There's many more conversations that we need to have, and we'd love to have broaden that and include many more stakeholders in that. An accountable utility board would serve ratepayers and fulfill LIPA's original promise after this transition. And a university-based energy observatory would or could provide much needed oversight, engagement, and expertise to respond to the challenges of climate change and the opportunities of emerging technologies. Thank you for hanging in there for our presentation.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your rolling with the punches there. Seems to be potentially a bombing there with access to the whiteboard functions trying to get in our way. So thanks for bearing with us. In a moment, my colleague Danny is going to reopen the chat. And I will just remind you that the way that this is going to go is that the core group of presenters, along with some of our friends on deck, including myself potentially, will do our best to answer questions in a timely manner and try to get to as many as possible. Again, we're not going to be able to get to everything. There's a diverse constituency of people here. We're going to try to do some groupings of questions. So the chat is about to open. Please send in your comments and remarks. And we will turn it to the panelists as appropriate to start answering some questions about the content of tonight's evening. So I'll give it a second for a couple folks to ask some questions and see if we can't get some going and then start some grouping and see how we can get along here. So. Let me give everyone a chance to unmute as we get these questions in. Okay, so let's go with, is there data about how power mismanagement and responses to power outages impact BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color communities on Long Island? I don't know, either Michael or Johanna in your.
I can,
yeah, please.
Not speak to Long Island specifically, and so I leave it to my colleagues who are within New York State. But I will say that to just bring it back to Texas for a moment, what we've seen is that it is affecting BIPOC communities first, and quite often worst. For instance, when we're seeing kind of planned shutoffs occur, they're often happening in some of the most vulnerable communities, BIPOC communities, because that's not where quote unquote critical infrastructure is located. And that is just like showing the deep inequities in terms of how climate and energy planning is being done at this point in time. So I'll leave it open to Long Island, but I think that this is a critical and pervasive problem in terms of how we are handling our, where we're seeing shutoffs occur.
Yeah, I have not seen that. There's a lot of research needs for Long Island. This is one of the reasons we really need an institute or an observatory and a set of partners to do this. Because you'd want to look at, in terms of Black and Indigenous and people of color communities across the island, there's where the infrastructure is, and then there's the pollution issues by the generation, and also by other infrastructure. And then there's outages, and do those, which communities are facing the longest outages? We know that coastal, some of it we know about the geographic locations, but not a lot of data around outages overall.
Okay. So it looks like we have a couple groupings of questions around union and labor concerns. So I'll just ask them because they're all pretty related. So what is the mechanism by which this content will be injected into the review process with the labor board? Would workers be considered New York State employees? As a private utility employee / union member, what happens to those organizations if public ownership takes place? I feel any of our presenters will be well suited to answer that question.
So I'll just say one point of fact that we know is that in the original LIPA legislation and bylaws, there's a successor clause so that any unionized worker unit maintains the same salary and benefits that it has under the existing one. So this transition happened before with National Grid to PSEG, and that was what happened with the unionized workforce in that transition, and that would happen as well. There's also been discussion about whether or not the union would enter into the pension plan. This will be something else to get clarity on. I don't know if anybody else on our team wants to say anything about that. The state pension plan, that is. Or if we just don't know, it's not clear.
Okay. So there are some questions specifically around the observatory model. How would the observatory avoid corruption? As it is supposed to be the independent of the government, how would dark money and lobbyists be kept out of this configuration?
Right. So the observatory as a non-governmental organization would have a board made up of stakeholders that would be consistent with its mission. So you'd want to have community, you want to have BIPOC community, you want to have labor, you want to have environmental advocates, and other stakeholders that you would think are necessary to this mission of a democratic, resilient power authority. Everything could be transparent. You just write it in. So we've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of work in the last 12 years on this. If you want to make sure there's no dark money, or you want to make sure that there's no decisions made behind closed, then you just write it into the bylaws. There's transparency in terms of where the money comes from and when decisions are made and how they're made, what the vote looks like and everything. So it's a great check in this mix. There also could be additional. You could imagine a very pluralistic setup, but that's something that we could design is fully transparent from the beginning, just in terms of both how it's funding, who gets paid what. In nonprofits, it's very easy to set up that kind of a situation where all that's publicly known.
All right, thank you. We have a question that says, I'm a longtime activist and Hofstra Law graduate and worked under Scott Cullen at the Star Foundation. Lots of good ideas here, but how do we force this through our government? The general idea has been talked about since I was in law school in 2000. And I believe Lisa wanted to address that.
Yeah, so thanks, Josh, so much for that question. Really appreciate that. Really, the time is now. Why we came together as a group is because LIPA is really having these conversations, PSC is, due to the history, like we can actually get there in the next 2 months. We are so close. And if we all put our efforts together and really work together on this, we can make this happen. So I know, it's for years we've been wanting this, but right now we are like so close to getting it. And I think Texas actually can push this over that line right now. The fear people have, and if everyone here gets active, and we have a lot of senators on this call, which is very exciting, this is the moment. And so I'm really excited. I normally am very pessimistic about this work, about what's going to happen quickly, but I really believe in the next few months we can get there with the right support. We can get to one piece of it. The second piece is how we democratize LIPA. I don't think we're going to get there in 2 months. We're going to work on that together. But there is an action right now LIPA will be taking. We're going to tell you how to do that in just a little bit, but we need all of you to activate on this.
Can I just add a word to that? I was reading LIPA's reports on ISIS this afternoon and on the performance of PSEG, and I was pleasantly surprised to see how favorable their options report was on the municipal option. They basically said the other options are really not going to solve our problems. I was astonished to see that. So we'll see. The vote is coming up, but I think that shows that this is a real opportunity. And if they have a sense that there's strong support for this option on Long Island, it wouldn't surprise me if they decided to give it a go.
So Tom Falcone is on this call right now. He's participating, the head of LIPA. I mean, I've been very impressed with LIPA's research on municipalization. I really expected a lot of pushback, but they were showing research that we've been using ourselves. It seems as though the staff is really engaging in a real way. Like, this is on the table right now. Like, this can happen in the next 2 months if we make it happen.
Yeah, and I appreciate, oh, sorry, Michael. I just want to know, because in the agenda, we have a take action and next steps portion, but I appreciate the hunger and eagerness for folks. I see a couple questions in the chat. We actually have an explicit toolkit. There's a LIPA board meeting coming up. There's media pushes you could be doing. There's some actions targeting around the governor to give him some phone calls. So plenty of that. And there were some questions. Yes, the presentation will be shared along with the slides. That's the same thing. I meant to say the recording and the slides. So before asking the next question, it sounded like, Michael, you wanted to add a couple things.
Yeah, just to repeat that, their LIPA board will make a decision about how to proceed by March 31st. That's the timeline that's been set. There's a LIPA board meeting on Wednesday, which you'll hear more about. But this timetable is this legislative session, right? So then the action would have to take, if they do go the municipalization route, which we certainly hope so, then state legislation would take place this spring.
Great. There is a question. It says, why do we think that a municipally owned company will have better response to storm than what we have now? What will be the big difference on that account? And I think that was addressed in throughout the presentation. I believe Christian Eros from Suffolk BSA wanted to provide a response to that. And then, of course, any other panelists are welcome to share. Sorry, I know I have to find you, Christian, and unmute you.
Hi, there you go. Hi, everyone. It's Christian Eros, Suffolk County DSA. And to answer that specific question, it's because when we officially make LIPA a municipal entity, it therefore has the obligation first and foremost to the residents, to the ratepayers. In terms of storm responses, it has to respond in the same way you expect the fire department to respond to a fire. Instead of working through a bureaucratic management system like what happened with Isaias, where everyone was discoordinated, there was no ability to coordinate between one resident that needed this power line down and another resident that had a malfunctioning refrigerator and their medication went stale. When it's all under one authority, when it's all under one entity, that response can be coordinated much easier. And there's no one in New Jersey, no one anywhere else that gets to dictate the calls here. It's all within the one body that's capable of administering, coordinating the logistics, and getting people out there as quick as possible. That's really why we saw Freeport respond so quickly and effectively.
Thanks. Any other remarks there?
Yeah, to jump on to, I think, exactly what Christian was just saying. I think, to look to PG&E and what occurred with the wildfires there, a major reason that it reacted that they had these massive wildfires occur was because PG&E had not invested in its grid, and that was consistent year after year, and it was going because of a bit of the profit-based model, whereas here I think you have a real opportunity by bringing this in-house for that to really shift the calculus in terms of how decisions are being made, so that it's actually focused on Long Island and Long Islanders instead. So, I think that's a really key and core component why I think resiliency and reliability can be higher with public power.
A public authority has control over the profits, and you can put that profits back in. And this is why we see public authorities being more reliable, because they can make these investments. And the other thing here is that you got to build in redundancy. So you have the profits that are being reinvested. You have a university that's helping you to monitor. You have partnerships across Long Island with different local governments on emergency response. So you're creating multiple connections and utilizing and drawing on multiple kinds of expertise, as opposed to being this behind the doors, we make $10 million, we're smarter than you, we don't need to talk to you.
I think, yeah, Mike, that's a really good point in terms of the coordination and planning abilities of something that is like has the ability to more effectively integrate itself within some of the other like pieces that it takes to create resiliency and to do emergency management.
And look, in Texas, and I lived in Texas. My brother's born in Texas. I grew up in the South. I'm not going to knock on Texas here, but their system incentivized, the market incentivized cutting rates, not investing in infrastructure. So they didn't insulate pipes. The nuclear reactor sensor froze, and they had to shut down one of the reactors, even though they've been warned in 2011 to upgrade and winterize a nuclear reactor. A public authority is not incentivized that way, right? It's incentivized a completely different direction to being accountable to its public constituencies.
I would just like to emphasize, as you've been saying, that private enterprise is looking at quarter to quarter planning. And especially in the age of climate change, we need to look 20, 30, 40, 50 years out, if not further, to know what's coming. And that's the only way to be responsible to a community. And you're just never going to get that from private industry unless they're absolutely required to do it. And even then, it's not going to be wholehearted.
Thank you all. So there have been a couple questions around the legislative pushes and around the election of LIPA board members. There's a question saying, regarding the proposed legislation, instead of electing the LIPA board by district, if voting were at large, would it minimize the potential for the positions to become overly political, with board members concerning themselves with too narrow an area? And then there were similar things of what keeps an elected board being elected on a partisan basis, and candidates are on the basis of making short-term promises that shortchange the future. And talking about how the board elected at large could minimize an elected board being elected on partisan issues. Oh, sorry, it was just an emphasis on the original question. And I'll just quickly respond before opening it up to others to say, we're not advocating in that specific realm any particular way. We offered at the beginning a pluralistic approach and shared some of what is out there. We're specifically advocating for this observatory model and more participatory structures of governance, and asking us to reimagine the way that we're all interrelating with this utility after a decision, the right decision is made to municipalize at the end of March, from our perspective. And when it comes to the democratic election of boards of trustees, there's no clear great answer, right? Each one comes with a set of trade-offs, whether it's by the county, whether it's by town resolutions, whether it's by election districts, whether it's by writ large. So part of that is what conversation can we have in a new era where we have a full public power authority, and we get to have that hard conversation about what is the best approach there. And so I just want to reemphasize that we shared some of the pre-existing ones, not specifically advocating for that approach, but just to name that there are different ways to make decisions about this that we're really invested in having a larger dialogue with constituencies about. Anything else to add from our presenters? Okay. I'm just going through more of the stuff here. Let's ask this question. Doesn't Cuomo pretty much control everything? Lisa.
Yes and no. It's such a weird question. Right now is so yes and no. And so we do have a board member, possibly more, on this call. And at the end of the day, we have seen that in LIPA, in all of, Cuomo controls a lot. That is his way of how he operates as a governor. But what we believe right now, and I'm going to talk about at this moment, I believe this is in the hands of the LIPA board and LIPA staff to move forward, and the local elected officials. And I believe that the governor will move in the way that we believe he should move. And if we show our outreach and we continue with our calls, we've been calling the governor, we will continue with that. I believe that that will make us win. And then we can truly have full control over our own energy system. And what we're talking about is not having him being able to control us. This is the beginning of a longer conversation. We think in the next 2 months, we can move to change this. But at the end of the day, we have to have control of our own systems. When we talk about what happened with even Northport Power Plant and the different power plant conversations, it would have been a much different conversation it was the community having that conversation about how do we talk about ourselves? How do we protect property taxes for our family members? And we are all in this together. It's not been set up like that. It's been set up as like a traditional business, but with some government pieces. So we believe that, you know, Cuomo certainly has a role. He has a role in appointments, clearly. And to be honest, we've felt that the Assembly and the Senate have not been putting appointments on that have been challenging Cuomo because of the way the whole system works. And so we want to have a new day. And so Cuomo does not control everything right now. We think he wants to listen to the LIPA board, LIPA staff. And that's how we believe. And let's be honest, you read the news. His power right now is challenged. There's a lot of drama between the pandemic and the nursing home scandal. There's a lot going on. At the end of the day, we have to speak for Long Islanders. So Cuomo is not going to stop us. I believe he will do what the community wants if we set the stage for that. And then it's for ourselves to control this new municipal system. And that's something we're going to do in the future.
So we're actually running out of some questions. I want to note a couple things that might lend themselves to some general comments, and also just note that like there are specific questions being directed at certain actors on this call that I just named to say, you know, folks are hungry for answers. So there was a comment that said there's a need for LIPA to be more transparent, to be more accountable. It's deeply felt from the clean energy perspective on Long Island. It would also be ideal to have board members with a background in environmental justice and clean energy. The proposals process for board members should be more inclusive and involve more stakeholder input. We agree. How likely do you think it is for any of these suggestions or those made in the presentation to be taken up by LIPA? Any feedback from them on this? So noting that this is not a presentation by the LIPA Board of Trustees, I would offer and hope that members of the trustees and staff would like to think about this and have conversations about this publicly, maybe at some of the upcoming board meetings before a decision is made. And then I would just offer for ourselves a kind of reinvestment in like public power means both literally public power and like the power of the public, right? So like we're here at the Long Island Progressive Coalition, a grassroots community-based organization as a part of, you know, our statewide coalition with New Yorker News, we're what made the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act happen. When organized people, constituencies of people come together, we can do whatever whatever we think is possible. Like overhauling the entire economic trajectory of one of the largest economies in the world, which we did in 2019, which is pretty neat. And so I would just say that the ability for us to move forward on a lot of the proposals requires us to be an organized constituency of people working together to advance those. We need to municipalize, and then in the process of municipalization, convene a series of deeply meaningful community participation in order to shape the new structures of this utility. So I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts to offer there.
I would just add to that this is really the beginning of a process. I mean, I know it's been going on for 20 years, but if not 40 years. But at this moment, it's the beginning of a process, and the vote is really the first step. Assuming the board does vote in this direction, that is really just the beginning of the conversation. There'll need to be changes in legislation and many other ways to participate. And I'll just, you know, remind you, and I'm sure many of you were involved in this, the process of passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act was years of organizing, years of mobilizing, years of advocacy. In the end, tremendously effective advocacy, and then tremendously effective advocacy on the part of the legislature. And then finally, I think the governor's 3 weeks before the end, he made a public announcement that he would never sign this legislation because of the set-asides for environmental justice communities. And in 3 weeks, he was having a meeting with 1,000 people in Fordham with Al Gore as his guest. And it then became his. And that's really the best way, I think, to work with the governors.
It only took us 8 hours of sitting outside of his office with environmental justice leaders across New York State in the final week of the budget session to make it happen.
Well, yes, I'm not saying it's easy, but
no, I know. I'm validating everything that you're saying.
Yeah. So, and I want to add, I see Assemblyman Steve Engelbright on the call, and you know, he was really the champion, and Senator Kaminsky. I don't know if he was on. I know his staff was on. I think what's really important to note is that on Long Island, energy typically would have like 3 white men going to the board meetings at LIPA, and no one thinks people want to participate in energy discussions, and there's no reason to do it. And I think what today shows us right now is there are a lot of people across Long Island from many different communities and the sign-on statements that care about energy. It's not just about oil and gas anymore. It's about climate change. And there are people who want to go together to figure out how do we fix it for our children, for my daughter, for other people's grandchildren. And so we're really happy to have everyone here, but we want to make sure it's not about energy wonks. This is about communities. And part of the CLCPA was not the CLCPA, it was called our slave name. It was a different name that the governor changed, and he took equity out. And we must fight within LIPA to make sure equity stands front and center. And we have not had that discussion on Long Island enough. And we are all here to have that discussion together, and we're here to work together as individuals and elected officials, community groups, work together to that common good.
So there are a few more questions. Just given the time, we will try to do our best to follow up with folks. There were some things around how meeting the mandates of CLCPA actually happens, investment in grid resiliency, questions about importing the energy of offshore wind. I think I can try to sum up in our best way is that we think a more participatory public model will help us answer these difficult questions, which might feel like a cop-out, but is also true. And so I'm just going to share my screen and just name a couple of next steps. Can everyone see the presentation? Sorry. So we have a couple of next steps. So for the LIPA trustees and staff, terminate the contract with PSE&G, commit to municipalization, listen to your own findings, and commit to an open community process within the transition. For electeds who are on this call in your various capacities, speak out for public power. Issue town resolutions where appropriate, pen letters to the editors or op-eds, begin exploring legislative changes that will need to happen in order to enact this transition, begin processes for public hearings, and commit to open community processes within this transition. And then for the general public, we want to note that there is an upcoming LIPA board meeting on the 24th at 11 a.m. So I'm going to put the link to that in the chat where people can testify. If you are not able to attend in person, you can also submit comments at this link below. And more, everything that I just named here and more in terms of what you can do as individuals and as organizers, as activists, and as elected officials can be found in the toolkit that I just shared, where we give some sample talking points and sample comments to testify at upcoming hearings. We have a link, a hotline to call Governor Cuomo and express the public support. Last week, we set up the hotline and got over 150 calls. If you want to get involved in the kind of core organizing efforts around this and want to be more engaged in the work that we're doing on a daily and weekly basis to advance this, you can email me at rmadden@lipc.org and get involved. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. I am once more just for sorry, just to make sure, I'm going to share again the toolkit in the chat. I hope everyone opens that up and utilizes it. I hope people follow up with us. We're in a really critical moment here, and we think that, as was noted by Eleanor Stein, the kind of logic of the way we think about our political, social, and economic systems in the age of the climate crisis need fundamental retooling. And we see the role of the LIPA Board of Trustees and the staff in this moment as helping to reimagine the way our communities relate to energy and fundamentally, again, change the way we do everything as it relates to the governance of this public good. So with that, again, please use the toolkit. Please make calls. Please testify at the upcoming hearings. Please email me to get involved. And also, we will be sure to send out a follow-up email with the presentations, the recording, links to the toolkit, and other things. This is hopefully only the beginning, because in 2 months, LIPA will make the decision to municipalize, and then we'll have a whole series of difficult conversations to have, but that will be better serviced under a public model. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Be well, and please, please, please stay in touch.